Welcome in to Vol Basketball Fever, your number one source for discussions about the Vols and Lady Vols basketball programs. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a video, and check in every week for new episodes of the show, video breakdowns, and more. Now, on with the episode. Hello, Vol fans, and welcome in to another episode of the Vol Basketball Fever podcast. I am Nathanael Rutherford, joined by Gene Henley here for, I guess now, Gene's the first offseason episode of the show for at least the men's side. Lady Vols, as of recording this, are still in the NCAA Tournament. They'll be playing Belmont, the upset over Oregon. This will be an in-state matchup in Knoxville on Monday when the Lady Vols and Belmont play. So congrats to Belmont. I always like seeing the in-state schools get victories, and especially when they're upsets and double-digit seeds taking down single-digit seeds. But Gene, I'm not even going to bother with the spiel about subscribing to the channel and where we are in podcasts and stuff like that. I'm just going to dive right into it. I knew we'd be talking eventually about Tennessee getting bounced in the tournament. I just was. I know I feel honestly kind of dumb, I guess, for maybe getting my hopes up. I don't know. I thought this team was different. We talked last week about winning the SEC tournament and stuff, and I think maybe dumb's a harsh word, but I just feel like I had convinced myself, and I think a lot of people had listening to this podcast too, that this team was different. That winning the SEC tournament, especially doing that the first time in 40-something years, 43 years. That, okay, this team has actually peaked at the right time, that they're playing their best ball at the right time. They actually did something in postseason that Tennessee hasn't done in forever, that even some of Tennessee's best coaches haven't ever done. Bruce Pearl never won the SEC tournament. I guess Ray Ramirez did, but you look back at just decades and decades of coaches at Tennessee, and none of them were able to do that. This finally happened, and you're thinking, okay, you look at the draw in Tennessee's NCAA bracket, and you're thinking, all right, this is a pathway to probably at least the Sweet 16. You looked at who you match up in the first round, easy win. Obviously, that turned out to be an easy win. Second round, you're thinking, okay, Michigan or Colorado State, those are teams Tennessee can beat. They match up okay with both of them. I remember thinking I didn't really want to play Michigan because of Hunter Dickinson and just the bigs that Michigan has. And well, here we are, Gene. Because of those bigs, particularly because of Hunter Dickinson, who just at one point was just beating the ever-living daylights out of Tennessee. He finished the game with 27 points and 11 rebounds. I also had 4 assists, and he himself was 3 of 5 from 3. He hit half of Michigan's threes in that game. Eli Brooks finished with 23 points. You also had Musa Diabate, who had 13 and 6. Terrence Williams had a nice contributions there as well with 9 points and 3 rebounds. You also looked at point guard Devontae Jones for them in that game. I knew he'd play, but then he left early because of injury. He didn't play at all in their first round game against Colorado State. But Gene, the thing you said, one of the first thoughts I had after Tennessee got eliminated was stuff that you had said, maybe even last podcast, but you'd said it, multiple times throughout the year, that this team, when the offense can't hit threes, that's when they struggle to find a way to win. And it happened at the worst possible time. It wasn't like Tennessee had a bad shooting night. They literally had their worst shooting night from 3 of the entire season. 2 of 18. Their 2 made threes were the fewest made threes that Tennessee had in the game all season. Their 11.1% shooting percentage from 3 was also the worst shooting percentage from 3 in the entire season. So they had, in the first round, a phenomenal game shooting the 3, 14 of 24 against Longwood, 2 of 18, and quite literally the worst shooting performance from 3 the entire season. And it came in the round of 32 against Michigan, and Tennessee remains winless against Michigan in NCAA tournament play. I think for me, Gene, it's the feelings I have about this season, which I guess we can kind of get into in a minute. Yeah, I'm going to save that and talk about that later on the podcast. I'm going to talk about this game specifically. You can't have bad days in the NCAA tournament. You can't, there is no, okay, we had a bad game, we'll watch the tape and bounce back, next week or, next weekend or whatever, here in 3 days, like you could in the regular season. You have a bad game in the NCAA tournament, you're probably out. It's kaput. You're done. And that's what happened in Tennessee. They had a bad shooting game. And I thought the defense didn't play great either. I thought there's Michigan, you got to give credit to Michigan. Their offense was able to, be decisive and attacking and, found weaknesses in Tennessee's defense that a lot of teams haven't been able to do this year. But I thought Tennessee's defense didn't play how they were capable of playing. They played really well for like a 4-minute stretch in the second half where I thought Tennessee was okay. They may be starting to hopefully close out this game. And then Michigan responded with like an 8-0 run or something like that. I can't remember what the run was, but responded and retook the lead. And then it just felt over from there. Tennessee could not hit a shot. Their offense went stagnant. And again, credit to Michigan's defense. Their defense played really good for a lot of the game. They took Tennessee, they took Santiago Vescovi out of his element for sure. He did not look comfortable out there at all. He could not get any space at all. And I saw people complaining about, was it too physical and certain stuff? I don't think so. I think there's some foul calls that could have been made that weren't, but I genuinely think that, the officiating wasn't awful in the game. I saw some people disagree with that, and I don't know. I don't think the officiating may not have helped Tennessee, I guess, but Tennessee really didn't help themselves. That was Tennessee's fault. They lost this game. We have a lot to cover, Gene. There's obviously the Rick Barnes discussion people have been having about, Rick Barnes in March. But I'm looking at this game as it was just a bad game for Tennessee, and you can't have bad games in March. And it just is what it is. It doesn't mean this team sucked. It doesn't mean this season necessarily was a massive disappointment, because that's another thing you and I have talked about where you don't there's a large emphasis on March, but I don't think you can distill down the entire season to what happens in the NCAA tournament, because it's such a crapshoot. We've seen that, and we've talked about that on the show. But it was severely disappointing for the game and that season to end the way it did on Saturday, and it just leaves such a bitter taste in, I think, everyone's mouths, and the players and the fans and everyone involved with, being a fan, being in that program. I think it just leaves such a gut punch. Like I don't know anyone who was. I don't know anyone who was. I don't know. I saw people angry. I saw people sad, but most of which is like a confusion. Like I'm not really sure how to react kind of feeling, because it just didn't feel like it should have ended this way for this team, especially. But maybe it should have, because as we said, you live by the 3, you die by the 3, and Tennessee, Gene, certainly died by the 3 against Michigan.
Right. Well, first off, I wanted to kind of give you your time to vent.
Thank you.
Kind of get it off your chest. And that, I think I'm here for you in that regard. In terms of, secondly, shout out to Devontae Jones, who played his first 2 years of high school at Tyner in Chattanooga. Really good kid. He was displaced Chattanooga because of Katrina. Spent 2 years in Chattanooga, then went back to New Orleans, played at Coastal Carolina. And obviously he's now at Michigan. He didn't really get a chance to do anything yet last night. I mean, because of whatever. I think he had a concussion going into the game, and then wasn't able to play an awful lot. But yeah, I mean, and I have mentioned a lot of times this year, I mean, can they generate offense when they're not hitting shots? And it would be very easy for me to point to the 2 of 18 and say, well, they didn't. But if you look, I mean, Tennessee hit shots. They just weren't threes. I mean, they scored almost 70 points, not hitting threes. Like, they were generating offense. Defense would hurt them. I think Michigan shot like 56% from the field in the second half. If you get performances like Dickinson and Eli, number 55, Brooks, you get performances from guys like that. I mean, you miss a couple offensive rebounding opportunities that really kind of hurt you. And it all just kind of comes together. And I think the bigger issue was the fact that they just didn't really have an answer for Dickerson. And he was so effective, all game long. I thought Urosh played well at moments, but everybody else that they have is either too young. That Tennessee has either too young or just too light. And that's why you have to have, that's probably finding somebody else would have, in hindsight, been a pretty decent idea, even if that guy was like a 6'8". Who they needed was E.J. Anasicki, a guy like that. Like, just a guy who can throw a body at him and, maybe neutralize. Huntley Hatfield is young. He's a year away. Adu, year away. Fulkerson, too light. And so you start running out of options, and you're trying different things to kind of slow down what they do, and they just then, you take him away, and then here comes Brooks. I don't remember exactly what Brooks had in the second half, but I felt like it was a lot. And, it's just, you take away – they're, Tennessee's most, dynamic outside threat. And, Chandler, played his tail off in that game, and you can see it afterwards in terms of the emotion. But, I think that, they lost that game because they didn't guard the second half.
Yeah.
Not like you're accustomed to that program guarding.
Mm-hmm.
And, that has more to do with the loss as opposed to any sort of offensive woes. 2 for 18 is not going to win you a lot of games from 3, but you also scored 70 points. So I'm not necessarily going to point specifically to that reason. 0 for 9 from 3 in the second half, and you still were pretty effective otherwise. I can't remember exactly what you shot, but I'm pretty sure you made like 60% from 2 in the second half. So, you were making shots, they just weren't threes. Maybe a 3 or 2 would have helped in that regard, but you were manufacturing offense. I think that's important. I think it's more the defensive part. That's the part that is, I would imagine, is more disappointing because that had been your calling card all year. I think everybody kind of felt like you could win games. You can win games when, you scored. Usually Tennessee scores 68 points. They're not losing because of the defense. But I think that's the part that's more surprising to me is they gave up 75. I would expect Tennessee losing a game like 63 to 57 or something along those lines, not 74-68 when you tell me that they're shooting 2 for 18 for 3. Just because, the way that they guard, you expect that to be, an advantage, and it just wasn't last night.
I think the way my mind works, Gene, is obviously last night, or we're recording this on Sunday night. So Saturday night, I was upset. I was a weird, again, I mentioned earlier, a weird combination of, I think a lot of fans of sad, mad, and just kind of not really sure I just really had to react to it. So I just kind of let that simmer, went to sleep on it, and woke up, still kind of feeling the way it was. My brain tries to, as I've gotten older, tries to dwell less on things and tries to go more into how can I fix it to fix it mode, which I know you can't always do that with things, and it's not how things always work in life. But that's bled over into my fandom of, I try not to dwell on, what happened, whether good or bad. I try to move on to the next things. Okay, how can things get better to make sure this bad thing doesn't happen again, or how can things continue on this stretch so the good things that have been happening do continue to happen. And I think you kind of mentioned it. We talk about Dickinson having the dominance. You talk about Eli Brooks having what he did, and you made a good point that you either had basically the bigs that Tennessee had were either too old, I guess, necessarily for Fulkerson, too young, or they're not gifted enough, or again, they're too young. And the ones that are younger have more athletic talent and gifts, but they aren't, grizzled enough and veteran enough. I think the right mix of those two types of things was Olivier Campbell, but unfortunately, he's out and was out from the South Carolina game. I think having him in that game, I think if he was in that game, Tennessee wins, maybe not, but I think Tennessee has a better chance of winning if Cam was in there. I think that's something that I had kind of forgotten until this morning, that Tennessee still technically had, they've been playing without him for a month or longer, but you were down a starter, for that game, and down a starter for, again, a large chunk of the season. But I wonder how differently things would have gone if you had Camwa in there and was able to play. Again, we will never know, just like we'll never know when Tennessee got bounced early in the second round in 2018 when Kyle Alexander was out and Louisville Chicago was able to get a lot of backdoor cuts and run do better on offense than I think people expected because of not having a rim protector. And Camwa isn't a rim protector necessarily, but kind of. He did a really good job of guarding the paint. So I think, next year, looking ahead to next season, I feel like this podcast is going to bounce back and forth between what just happened and looking ahead to next year, at least in my mind it will. Next, you have Camwa back. You have Brandon Huntley. Well, you likely will have Brandon Huntley, Hadfield, Jonas Adu, and Urosh back next year. Fulkerson's the only big that's for sure gone. You could have Brandon Huntley, Hatfield decide to maybe try to do something in pro leagues or whatever, G League or overseas. You could have him transfer. I don't think Adu transfers because I think he saw his playing time go up, and I think he sees a future here. Urosh is not going to transfer on his own volition. I think the only way he would do it is if he was asked to, but I don't think he'll be asked to because I think Barnes does, and the staff, they do like what they have in him. Gamewa, again, if he's healthy, he's starting next year. You need to go get either an instant impact, like actual instant impact freshman who, like a Jabari Smith type, which again, easier said than done, for sure. But a guy who isn't like a more like a Jabari Smith and less like a Huntley Hatfield or Adu, who have the skill set to come out and be contributors day one for you, and can play 20-25 minutes day one for you. Again, I know it's much easier said than done. Jabari Smiths don't just grow on trees. That kid is a ridiculous talent. But we'll get into it in a second. There is a power forward in the 22 class who Tennessee, I think, is targeting now and is an interesting play. But I think it's through the transfer portal. You have to go address your need in the post and the transfer portal. You don't need a dominant big man like Hunter Dickinson can be. Like, you don't need that. You don't need a Walker Kessler, for example. You don't need to like have to go get like the best big man on the market. But you need someone who is capable of I think being productive. We've talked about how guard heavy things are, and Tennessee has really good guards. They're going to have really good guards again next year. Kenny Chandler is gone, but you're going to have, well, probably Vescovy. I kind of wonder if he's going to go and test the waters overseas, especially because of him being an international player. If he goes and decides, hey, I'm going to go back closer to home, and I've been in college for a long time. I don't think he's an NBA player, but I think he's a guy who could go make a lot of money back overseas, back closer to where he's from. So I'm kind of curious and see if he comes back next year or not. Even if he doesn't, you have BJ Edwards coming in. You have Sakai Ziegler. You have probably Josiah Jordan-James. I don't see him leaving. I guess he could, but I don't see it happening. But you have that core. You probably have Justin Powell coming back. Victor Bailey is an interesting one to talk about. We have a lot of discussions to have here in the next couple weeks, Gene, about the roster makeup and what it could look like. But I think the biggest need for next year is 100% going to be, you need to get a transfer big, I think. Like, I don't know that there's a bigger need on the roster than getting a true big man who can do something and be if nothing else, be a deterrent defensively to the other big men you're going to play. Because Tennessee didn't have that a whole lot. Urush could do it at times, but there was a lot of times when Fulke would get matched up with my guys. I thought that's not a good matchup for Tennessee. Cam Wad, did a good job of holding his own, but he's 6'8". He's not short by any stretch of the imagination. But if you can get someone who's a 6'10", 6'11", just enforcer type, who is more aggressive and honestly smarter, who has a better basketball IQ than Urush, because I love Urush's effort, but man, sometimes his reaction time and his basketball IQ just seem incredibly low at times. Again, he's not been playing basketball like all his life. I think he's one of the guys that had just kind of started late playing basketball, but you can tell it sometimes, especially in crunch moments where he gets frustrated and makes just bad decisions on the court. Tennessee needs someone who can be, if nothing else, an enforcer who makes more consistently good decisions as a deterrent to other big men and who can protect the rim and all these different things. And again, Adu can develop into that, but I'm not sure he's going to be that as a sophomore next year. He's ahead of schedule in terms of, if you're comparing him to Kyle Alexander, which I think a lot of people have, and I think I did at some point on the podcast too, he's ahead of where Kyle Alexander was as a freshman. But that's still not like, it's still not a guy as a sophomore you want to rely on to be playing 25, 30 minutes in a game. So I guess my thing, Gene, is this game really in particular highlighted to me, and there were a couple other times this year that it highlighted it to me too, but this game in particular highlighted that I think Tennessee, I don't think you need a dominant big man, because again, we're not playing in the 80s and 90s. The game has changed to be a lot more guard oriented. But if you need a big man who can run the floor, you need a big man who can be a productive player on both sides of the court, I think. I mean, again, at bare minimum, I think you need an enforcer, defender as the 5. But I think Tennessee, that's what they have the key in on. They have to go find a legitimate SEC caliber starting 5, or a starting, I guess, center, whatever you want to call it, for next year, because I think that's kind of the biggest key that's missing. That was missing from this team in particular, but I think that it will be missing from next year's team too if they don't address it.
So I think I talked about this at the beginning of, probably in the summer or somewhere along that line. I think that there's an issue going forward as far as Tennessee and bigs, because the question at some point has to be asked, and look, this isn't about like development of bigs. I'm not here to do that. But look around at some of the guys that you mentioned. Look at Jabari Smith. Could you imagine Jabari Smith playing the way he played at Auburn in Knoxville? I can't. I don't see a scenario where like he's given the freedom and the leeway to be that player in Knoxville. Maybe I'm wrong, but a lot of evidence suggests that I may not be wrong there. So, because like the system that is run, and that's a big part of this, and like that's like all the discussions that we've had. It's more watching the system that Tennessee runs, and it's a system where you're going to throw the ball in the paint, and guys are going to try to make plays or whatever. So I mean, we can go back to Kerry Blackshear if we want to. The way that Kerry Blackshear played was not. It may have worked out, and look, I think the kid made a bad decision not going to Tennessee. I do. But I also don't think that I don't know if there's probably some fear that he was not going to be afforded the liberties to be a guy out on the floor, on the perimeter, ball handling and doing all those sorts of things. Look at, again, Brendan Huntley Hatfield. Watched that kid play in the summer. That's a kid that Tennessee mainly got because of the Bobby Mays connection. I'm not suggesting anything there. I'm saying that played a major factor in them getting him, especially considering he reclassified and came a year early. Because we can't forget that Brendan Huntley Hatfield should be a senior in high school right now as we look at all of this stuff that's going on with some of the kids. That's a kid who should be a senior in high school, who did have some decent moments over the course of a season that should have been his senior year of high school. Then you've got Adu, who you felt pretty confident you were going to get because of the connection with the assistant coach that you brought from Marquette. So, like, if you just look, I know there was a time when Jabari Smith there was a flirtation between Tennessee and Jabari Smith. People felt maybe that was the case with Kessler to an extent. I feel like there's just, I don't know what's out there, what's going on. But I think that because of like the connections in the AAU communities, then the question is going to be, if people are talking to Brendan Huntley Hatfield and asking what's his experience been like in Knoxville, what's his answer? Because that'll determine if you can get guys. Because that's a kid who a lot of people felt was a completely different player than the version that we saw in Knoxville this season. And, myself included. And that's no knock. I'm just being honest. That's not the player I saw. And now that may not be the best version. Maybe the player we saw in Knoxville is actually the best college version of that kid. I just never saw a kid who is just going to pretty much kind of run block to block, run a foul line extended, catch the ball at the top of the key, hand the ball off to a guard and set a screen and roll. I just never thought that was his style of play. And if he's back next year, then he's comfortable with it. If he's in the portal, then he wasn't comfortable with it. He thinks he's something different. I can't speak on that because I don't know. I'm not trying to act like I have any knowledge of it, but that will figure itself out here in the upcoming days and weeks. So I think your point is true. Tennessee does need to get that guy. They do need to get some guy, and maybe they just need to develop, Adu a little bit more to where maybe he's that sort of guy. I just wonder if they actually have to go get him, can they? Because it's hard. Again, I just think it's kind of hard to get kids nowadays in the SEC specifically to buy into getting a bunch of touches in the paint. This is the Big Ten. a league that's full of bigs. I mean, I just watched one. I just watched one of the biggest ones play on Friday, and then I saw another one play Saturday, and Purdue's got one bigger than both of those guys. If that's the case, then so be it. But those kids are growing up playing that style of play, and there's probably no other way. Like, how are you going? I mean, the question is, how are you going to get the 6'9", 6'10" versatile guy that can do a lot of things? Because I wonder, does Brandon Huntley Hatfield see himself more as the next incarnation of Grant Williams, Olivier Conway, or does he see himself as more of a Jabari Smith? Because it almost suggests, and look, there's freedoms that are allowed in AAU that are not allowed in college. That's just the way it goes. I would not be stunned, though, if he kind of fancies himself as Jabari Smith, the catch and shoot guy who can do all these different sorts of things on the court, the guy he was at IMG, and maybe not so much the guy that we saw in Knoxville. So I just think it's going to be something to watch, something to see. I mean, we've not mentioned Tamba, who I think is such a developmental prospect. He is the sort of kid who would come in and be like your big post presence. But now, like, what are you going to do with a guy like Adu? Because you could develop him to be a more perimeter sort of option, because he can cover so much space defensively. My God, he can cover up so much space. He can cover up a lot of things defensively. He's elite. They're not just good. He's elite defensively. And you don't get that guy very often. But, like when you're just looking at what the interior situation looks like, it probably lends itself more questions, at least more questions than answers at this moment.
Would this be a case? We talked last week, or I guess while we were in the middle of recording last week, Tennessee had the news come out of Mike Schwartz heading to ECU. Would this be a case of whatever next assistant coach Rick Barnes brings in, that it's a big man specialist, I guess, like a guy who has coached big men and has a good, I don't know how, who's available or whatever, but whoever he brings in, like a guy who has a pedigree of coaching big men, because I think that would be, that could be a way to remedy it some, because you're right, like the points you've made, this isn't the first time you've said it on the podcast, the points you made are spot on. Rick Barnes doesn't have exactly a stellar track record of big men, especially in the last decade. Like, you can point to some guys he had at Texas for sure, but at Tennessee, I mean, he's developed guys, like you said. You can point to some of the development of those players, but it's also, again, the style they play. I think you're right. Would both Paolo Banchero, I guess, and Jabari Smith were both heavily interested in Tennessee for a while in the recruiting process. But again, I don't know that either of those guys would have played the same way, or, as you said, had the same success maybe this year as they did at their respective schools at Duke and Auburn. Maybe they would have. I mean, we'll never know, clearly. But Barnes hasn't had a big man get drafted into the NBA you can point to, because Grant Williams was a big man at Tennessee, but he's a guard basically in the NBA. So you can't point to him. Kyle Alexander's having he's not doing bad overseas and kind of bouncing around in the G League and Summer League and stuff in the NBA. But again, that's not it's not a good selling point to a 5-star center coming out of high school, or 5-star power forward coming out of high school. But my point is, should that be kind of the area that Rick Barnes addresses for his next assistant coach? Because we talked last week about, should it be a veteran guy or maybe a younger guy or whatever. But I think could that remedy anything? Could that help any of the recruiting process if Barnes goes out and gets somebody who has a track record with big men and maybe even the SEC, or just in general, just in college basketball?
Perhaps. But I think what's interesting is, I'm going to name drop a name here that I think is going to be in play, Frank Haith. I think that's a guy that's going to be heavily in play for that opening there. I don't think he'll he may get a head coaching job, in which case, we can screw up this out of the podcast, but I think that he's a name of somebody that will be heavily in play for that assistant job. That gives you a veteran guy on the bench. Has been successful, obviously. Has had some issues in some places. I'm pretty sure Tulsa and Missouri. But He's also a guy who kind of understands and is pretty good at coaching. Now, I don't know necessarily what his specialty is as an assistant, but he does offer a veteran voice on the bench. I'm sorry, I said Missouri. It was actually, I think, Miami that got in trouble. But regardless,
it's Miami and Missouri.
Tulsa was clean. I'm sorry, Tulsa's where he just left. So I think that you're just looking at a case where I don't think that development is the answer. Like, I mean, if you watched the guys individually on that team played well. Urosh played well this season. You look at the first 2 years and look at this year. Like, Urosh played well. Olivier played well. Huntley Hatfield became, a starter and had some nice moments. Adu had some nice moments. I just think that you're like this. I'm just not sure the system is conducive to having guys who are going to go out there and have the sorts of Jabari Smith or Banchero sort of performances and efforts. I just don't think the system is conducive to that. And, like, don't throw Grant Williams at me, who scored probably 75 to 80% of his points in the paint. And then, of course, and also you're talking about Grant, who, is a special player. Like, that's, like, I understand what he is in the NBA. He's no star. He's a solid 6'6" role player, and he does his job. And I think he was, like, either leading the league in three-point percentage, or he was certainly up there. But I don't know if just going and getting a guy who can develop it is the answer. I don't know, because, again, at the end of the day, the problem with last night was the fact they didn't guard the second half. It wasn't those other things. Urosh played decent. Fulkerson, the other guys, and like, they just weren't as good as a 7'1", All-American caliber player plays in. We could argue. Look, everybody can argue the SEC is the best conference. The Big Ten got 9 teams in, and there's still plenty of those 9 teams left.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't do the thing where, again, I just don't know if the system is conducive to Tennessee getting the sorts of players to make them look like an Auburn or make them look like a whatever. Like, you give Adu a year of experience, he can probably guard a guy like Dickerson a little bit better. I mean, like, their most athletic bigs were babies this year. I think that's the issue. I mean, like, Urosh battles because Urosh is a battler. That's who he is, and I've got a ton of respect for that. Fulkerson is going to fight. I just think that he is who he is, and he's always kind of been who he was as a player. And then you've got these two pretty elite, athletically, talented guys, but they haven't seen a lot. You are talking about a guy in Dickinson that is not. I mean, he's a sophomore, but that's a pretty talented player who's been through a little bit more than these freshmen who didn't even really play till second semester of this year. I don't think it's necessarily time to, pretty much just scrap everything. I just think that a year of development would help those two guys, and I guess figure out what what you can find in the portal, or if maybe a former LSU guy decides to take his talents to Knoxville, then so be it. But the portal is going to be chock full of players because coaching, this coaching cycle is actually, it's weird. The coaching cycle has actually gone relatively fast.
Yeah.
It's stunning that there's only 2 jobs available, and South Carolina could be filled. I'd imagine South Carolina's filled in the next 48 to 72 hours. Then everything else now starts to trickle down. Seton Hall is, they can't hire their new coach for a couple weeks because he's currently coaching the Cinderella St. Peter's. They can't because, obviously Seton Hall's coach took Maryland. So you're not going to have a ton of opportunities for new opportunities. So a vast majority of the portal is what it is. Chattanooga's coach may get South Carolina. What happens with that roster? I would look. Is everybody else South Carolina? It looks like they may be 6'8", 6'9", athletic, and willing to be a role player in college mostly, because that's largely what Tennessee's post players are just kind of glorified role players on good teams. Before anybody throws Fulkerson at me, on good teams, like the sorts of teams that you want to have, that you think you have when you're ranked number 5 in the country. That's good, not 17 and 13 or whatever they were 2 seasons ago. Check that out. Whenever South Carolina makes his hire, check that out. Missouri about to get a new coach, check that out. Just because you never know, everybody's seeing what these guys are at their current school. That does not mean that's what they're going to be at their next school. There's a lot of guys who look very different in other systems, and so look, that's a double-edged sword, and it could affect Tennessee too. If a guy if Huntley Hatfield is a different player than what we've seen, and he goes somewhere else, and all of a sudden he becomes that player, then that hurts. Yep. That actually speaks to the sort of quote unquote system that's there. That's not saying you change the system. It's just you have to find the right players that fit your system. But in terms of, like I said, at the end of the day, Tennessee had 2 babies out there that were trying to guard a pretty elite All-American caliber player. They just didn't quite get it done, and then had a bruiser who just couldn't quite get it done either. So they'll be okay next year. We'll see what happens with Frank Haith. I have reason to believe that he's going to be the guy, quite possibly, that replaces Schwartz. And if he is, good for him, and we'll see what qualities he brings. If he's got any players that maybe want to hop in the portal from Tulsa, check Tulsa out. That's what I'm saying. This is the portal is going to be packed. But the guys that come in have to understand they're not going to be, at least in theory, they're not going to be impact guys, because this is not a system that provides impact sort of, a sort of impactful addition in terms of recruiting. You're not going to get those guys that way. It could work out that way, but largely a school like Tennessee's not going to get those guys. Those guys are going to go elsewhere, because if you're transferring, it's because you're not happy with the system you're playing, and you're not going to watch anything that Tennessee did if you are a big and say, oh, okay, yeah, this is where I want to be. And whether that's fair or foul, I can't speak on that, but that's just kind of how it is.
Before we talk about another big man, I want to talk about your Frank Haith comment, because that would be interesting, and it would make sense. Like you said, he just resigned from Tulsa. He actually has coached under Rick Barnes as an assistant before, back in the early 2000s. He was an assistant at Texas before he left to get the head coaching job at Miami. So he and Barnes have a relationship. He's coached at Texas A&M a couple of times as an assistant back in the 90s, and then again coached at Texas in the early 2000s. So he was all around Texas. Barnes knew about him. He's coached in the SEC. He was Missouri's head coach when they first came over to the SEC. So he's been in the SEC. That would be interesting. And I've been looking at different stuff on him, because I was curious, like you said, I'm not entirely sure what his specialty is or whatever, but he was credited as kind of one of the lead recruiters for guys like Bradley Buckman and LaMarcus Aldridge, who are big men at Texas. Also credited as Daniel Gibson, who was not a big man. So I'm not entirely sure, what that means, or if that means anything at all. So I think, I don't know if would be coaching the post or whatever, or would be to take over the associate head coaching role like that Schwartz had. I'm not sure, but that's interesting, Gene. I think Haith would make sense. Like you said, he's got some interesting past, but it seems like it's been stuff that hasn't happened at least in a decade at this point or so. And again, Tulsa doesn't appear to have had anything happen while he was there. Just stepped down because, took the one NCAA tournament appearance. It looks like they might have been able to go the year COVID happened. They were, I think, tied for first in the AAC that year. But of course, tournament didn't happen, so it didn't matter. I don't remember what the tournament for that. I guess their tournament probably didn't start at that point yet. But anyway, that'd be interesting. So I'll be curious to see kind of how that goes. Before we get to the big man I want to talk about, you thought Tennessee shot poorly. Wisconsin today, Gene, just now as we're recording this, lost to Iowa State. Iowa State, by the way, from 0 to hero. I mean, they won, I think, 2-3 games total last season, and now they're on to the Sweet 16. But Wisconsin went 2 of 23 from 3. They shot 8% from 3, Gene. So it could actually have been worse for Tennessee. They could have shot 8% instead of 11%.
It hurt. Bad. It did kind of hurt them to not have one of the guys who was in play for National Player of the Year, Johnny Davis. Not having him for a portion of that game. I don't know exactly. I'm not exactly. He wasn't healthy.
Right.
I don't remember exactly how long he was out, but him not being 100% really hurt. But I mean, look, 2 for whatever, 24. You're not going to win a lot of games that way.
No. And the final score is like a 5-point margin. So if you make a couple of those threes you missed, then you win that game.
Yeah, like I respect that Tennessee again only shot 16 or 18 because there were so many times this year that number was in the 30s and 40s, and they could have easily chucked up about 30 in that game. But I mean, look, Michigan did a good job of basically saying your post play. If you want to play in the post, your post players aren't good enough. I'm sorry if we're going to take away your guards because we don't think your posts are good enough, and that's sobering. Yeah. Like that you're in a year. I mean, you're just at a time where in this league, those guys they may not want to play that way. Like, it's real easy to say, look, man, you're 7'1". Kofi Coburn, you're 7 feet and you are built like a god at 7 feet. Like 7'1", look, we got a place. We got South, the 7'3" kid that plays at Purdue.
Yeah.
Like it's very easy when you're that tall, but when you're a 6'10" guy in AAU, you're not playing that way. So therefore, in your mind, you've played your whole life being this guy out in the perimeter. Again, look at Adu. I saw his highlights. It was jacking threes left and right. Now, Tennessee's done a good job of getting that kid to kind of buy in from what I've seen so far.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, like Michigan had a good system. They had a good plan in place. We're going to take away your guards. We're going to take away 25 because we understand he's a great shooter, but we don't think he can get by us. He's a great shooter, but we don't think he can put the ball on the deck and get by us. Number 30, that kid's coming on as a shooter, but he ain't gonna attack the basket. He's getting to the mid range. We're gonna get up in your guards, and we're gonna make your guards. We're gonna make them put the ball on the floor. Obviously, Kennedy Chandler, that's just that feat's right in his hands.
Yep.
And obviously he was great yesterday, but nobody else was. Nobody else really came. I mean, Josiah was there early. Vescovy did not get there. And like every single time Kennedy Chandler drove, they basically, if we want to get down into the weeds of basketball nerdology, they basically said, okay, when Chandler drives, we're going to take away. We'll let him get to the basket, but we're not going to let him kick it out to Vescovy for a 3 or Josiah Jordan James for a 3 because we don't want those two guys to get going. Because if one of those they start seeing threes fall, watch out. So that's why, Chandler had a lot of, drives to the basket because that's what was available. They're like, we're going to take away their threes and we're going to make them beat us from 2. And like look, is that the game plan? Is that what you do? I don't know, but look, I know it worked yesterday, and it's unfortunate because I think everything that was said is true. As we always try to move on to the next thing, everything that was said about this team throughout the course of the season and entering the postseason was true. This team was national championship good, but they were also first weekend bad, and it all hinged on their ability to hit shots. And last night they didn't, and I think that's the biggest disappointment, was because I know everybody's going to take this, whatever the Barnes stuff is, and look, people that want to kind of just, smack the pinata without a blindfold on, if they want to do that, sure, so be it. That's your freedom, that's your right. I just feel like there's just so much more that there's so many different ways we can look at. We can break down those things. But everybody wants to do a totality thing. Well, he's got a losing record in March, and that's fine if you want to go that route. That's your prerogative. I just feel like there's so many better ways to discuss it. Got to hit shots. And, they weren't too tight to hit shots early in the games. So it wasn't like somebody could say, well, he had them too tight coming in, because – look, I saw the first few minutes of the game, Josiah was hitting everything.
Mm-hmm.
So, they were that first half was a pretty good back and forth affair early on. They just couldn't hit shots in the second half. If you want to blame adjustments or whatever, so be it. But look, man, they shot 60% from twos. Everything can't be, well, we didn't make the right adjustments. They made shots in the second half and Tennessee didn't. And sometimes it's just as simple as that.
Yeah, and like I said, top of the show, it just was a bad time to have your worst shooting game of the year. It just, from three at least, it just was. There's, but like you said, they didn't shoot horribly from two either. It just was I think you're spot on with your analysis. I would want to go back and watch the film to see it too, but that seems right, from letting Kennedy or Sakai both drive the lane and not allow them to dish it back out to Josiah or Santi for threes. That tracks in my head from what I remember watching the game, that they did not allow that to happen. And also to your point, and it's, supports things we've said all season. Looking at stats from the whole year, Tennessee this season 8 times had a game where they shot 25% or worse from three, and they only won 2 of them. And one of those was against Colorado on the road, where you had Kennedy Chandler take over in that game and had his, that was kind of his, almost like his breakout performance, where he kind of put things together and, had a really good game against a quality opponent. And that was on the road. And the other one was against Vanderbilt on the road, where you won 68-60 and shot 29 free throws in that game. It went 25-29 from the free throw line. So that helped, buoy you there, because you didn't shoot well from 2 in that game, and you shot pretty well you shot really well from 2 against Colorado, because again, that was a lot of Kennedy Chandler doing that. That Tennessee in that game was 25% from 3 against Colorado, but finished with almost 48% overall from the field goal range. So again, that shows that you shot well from 2 in that game. But against Vanderbilt, you shot 22% from 3 and 34% from the floor overall. So you did not shoot well anywhere in that game except for the free throw line, which really won that game for Tennessee. Against Michigan, again, 11% from 3, but 42% overall. So that, again, highlights that Tennessee shot better from 2. But again, Tennessee finished year 2-6 when they shot 25% or worse from 3. And 6 of their 8 losses came when they had, again, 25% or worse from shooting. So you played, live by the 3, die by the 3. And just what you said and kind of what I said earlier too, just for the most part, that was it. The only time Tennessee shot really well from 3 and lost this year was the Kentucky game, where, in Lexington, where Kentucky trounced them. Otherwise, even the other one of the losses that was not in the 25% was close. It was Texas, and Tennessee shot 28% from that one. So again, 7 of Tennessee's 8 losses happened where they shot under 30% from 3 this season. And that's going to track for a lot of teams, but that just is such a ridiculously high percentage of Tennessee's losses that it feeds into exactly what you said, Gene. Like, when teams had success is when they had the ability to make Tennessee, try to do something inside and couldn't, and they could take away an element and make Tennessee one-dimensional. And it mostly worked against. That mostly was what happened against Michigan too. Before we get to the Rick Barnes thing, because that's what I want to end the podcast on. I want to mention, as I've teased it here for a couple times now, the kind of big man, I guess, quote unquote, that Tennessee is involved with right now. And that's Julian Phillips, who is a 5-star in the 2022 class, who just recently decommitted from LSU. Actually, he didn't just decommit; he was like, he had signed early and everything. He got out of his letter of intent. He got the release from LSU because we didn't get a chance to talk about this last week, Gene, much at all. But there's been a lot of coaching changes in the SEC. The biggest one being Will Wade being fired at LSU because of a bunch of level 1 infractions amidst one of the investigation into LSU's program. There, I think, 5 level 1 infractions that they found for him. So he was canned, and now LSU's had, I think, all of their recruiting, most if not all of their recruiting class, asked for releases or decommit or whatever. And Julian Phillips was one of them. Tennessee was a pretty high level player for him before he committed to LSU. And now, before we record this, Gene, I saw that Rob Lewis of VolQuest had mentioned, without giving away too much, because I think it was probably behind a paywall, without giving away too much, basically saying that Tennessee is going to be involved again with Julian Phillips, who's a 6'8", 200-pound player, a 5-star, top 20 overall prospect on 247, and then the composite there too. Number 2 power forward in the country, depending on where you're looking at. Plays in Missouri. He's from Branson, Missouri. And plays for Lincoln Academy over there. I think, again, we're talking about Jabari Smith, all this different stuff. I would be really interested to see if Tennessee were able to get Julian Phillips. I don't know. I don't know right now that they will, but hold on, I gotta sneeze. Goodness. Okay. But if he comes here to Tennessee, like, what is he? How does Rick Barnes use him? What like you said, with the system that is run here in Knoxville under Barnes, what does that look like for a guy like Julian Phillips, he's not huge. I mean, body wise, he's lanky-ish. He's 6'8", 200. So that's not like a lot of weight on that 6'8" frame. So how is he used? Is he? Because you're not going to ask him to bang around down in the post. At least, I mean, you could, but I don't think that's going to be what he does. I haven't watched a whole lot of highlights of him, but I can't imagine that that's what he excels at. Looking at his write up here from, this is from 2020, but from Jerry Meyer, says he's a long, lanky, and athletic. Is it NBA athletic pop to him? But again, this is from 2020. It feels weird reading something from 2 years ago at this point, from May of 2020. So I'm not going to take that with a whole lot of salt. But he is a McDonald's All-American as well. But Gene, that could help. And it wouldn't hurt to get someone like that as a 6'8", 200-pound. I mean, even if he's 200 pounds, he'll gain some weight. But that would definitely, it would address some things for Tennessee. It wouldn't be the kind of like the 5 that I'm talking about Tennessee getting. But a guy like Julian Phillips, I think, would help. I don't know that even if you do get him, that's not the only move you make in the post in this offseason, in my opinion. You still got to go get someone from the transfer portal, in my opinion. But getting someone like a Julian Phillips would be a nice little boost, and would probably ease the pain a little bit from Vol fans if that were to happen. I don't know, what his timeline is or anything, but that would probably ease the pain a little bit from the sting of this loss.
Yeah, and I don't know enough about the kid to know exactly if there was like a good player comp. 6'8", 200 screams small forward to me. But also look at things from more of an, I guess, a professional perspective as opposed to a college one. I understand that, like it says, like, he's listed as a power forward, and who knows, maybe he's just a finisher. I don't know. I feel like a kid who's only 6'8", who is listed as a top 15 player in the country in the 24/7 composite, that guy screams to me a pretty skilled guy. Mm-hmm. That's about the size of a guy like Kerry Blackshear or whatever, I guess, coming out of high school. And so I just have to wonder, man, how does he fit? Like, how can Tennessee sell him on this? Because that's the big question to me. Because, yeah, if Tennessee's going to get involved everybody else that is involved is telling him they're going to turn you into a post player. Again, the question is, what does he want to be? Does he want to be Jabari Smith or does he want to be post player? 6'8", I'm not saying that he is Jabari Smith good. I'm talking about the style he wants to play. Is that conducive to coming to Tennessee? Because if it is, get him. And we'll have to see from that, because I just don't know enough about him to really opine too much more than what I've heard so far.
Yeah, I'm watching some highlights of him. Most right now, it's just been a lot of him running the floor and getting some alley-oops on transitions. But he can run. Like he can. I mean, as you imagine, being 6'8", 200, like he can run, he can move. He's not a slow kid at all. He's very athletic. But yeah, I mean, that's the big question. Like you said, that as what is the selling there, and how does Tennessee end up using him? I don't know. He's a very talented kid from the little highlights I'm watching right now. He moves well without the ball. He's got a nice jumper. He just nailed a shot right at the top of the key there that I was watching those highlights. So he's got skills. I'd be interested to see what happens with his recruitment. He's going to have, I think FSU and USC were two of the other programs that were in his top 4 before he committed to LSU. So I'd be interested to see if those two really get back into it heavily with him as well. And other schools, do they come calling? Yeah, I think he'd be interesting. If nothing else, he adds more skill to the position, which Tennessee needs. They need some more high level skill, but I don't think you can be done with the post if you get him. Because I also, again, future conversations we'll have in future episodes. What does the roster movement look like with this team? Because you're for sure losing Fulke. He has no more. He can't come back for a 7th year at this point. Kenny Chandler's gone. There's like a 1 in a million chance he returns for next year. I can't imagine he returns. He's gone to the NBA or to get drafted or whatever. Who else leaves? Because you're going to have, in this day and age, you're going to have a couple transfers. It's just a matter of who and why and whatnot. Because again, just because you're transferring doesn't mean that there's a falling out or that there's all this different stuff. But I'm looking at a couple different guys in this roster that had the potential to transfer. And I was asked on Twitter the other day, or actually on the YouTube comments on our channel here, and I said we would address it in a future episode. So we will address it in a future episode. And someone asked specifically about a couple of players and our thoughts on whether or not they'll be back next season. So we'll talk about that at a later date in a different episode. But I want to get to the last one here, Gene, the last topic, because I could talk for a long time on this podcast, but I don't want to make it too long. But the last topic, you already kind of hinted at it, is the whole Rick Barnes thing. And Rick Barnes in March, and it's like death and taxes. Rick Barnes getting bounced in the first weekend of March with a talented team. I already saw Dan Wolken had strike him while the iron's hot, and has I'd call him out there. I think his tweet said something about once it gets to March, Rick Barnes puts the red nose and tie-dye wig on, and something basically saying that he becomes a clown in March. So I thought, well, that's nice, Dan. But I was actually kind of surprised that I didn't see more of it on. Maybe it just means I'm not following the more negatively skewed crowd like I used to back, when I was younger and just fresh out of college and stuff. But I was surprised I didn't see more of the Rick Barnes kind of vitriol and stuff, or the, just Rick Barnes in March kind of thing than I did. There were definitely people who did it, and there's certain contingent of Vol fans who were the ones doing it like usual. But sometimes a lot of times you will see more than just that. I didn't see as much. I did see people bring it up and say things about it. But to your point, Gene, like you said, that what you said earlier I think resonated with me, because it's kind of how I felt too. I don't there's not really much that I can point to from that game against Michigan that I would put at Rick Barnes' feet and say he's the reason Tennessee lost this game. Because scheme-wise, Tennessee did, like, they had open shots. They did a lot fine. They adjusted well. I thought, especially in certain key situations, that there were some really good adjustments made defensively and stuff for, scheme-wise and stuff for Tennessee. They did what they could with the roster they had at this point. Again, you were playing without Olivier Camois. I think that would have made a big difference in this game. So you've had to adjust without him for the last month and a half, however long it's been. He has been out for this point, now with his foot injury, ankle injury, whatever it is. But at the same time, like as much as I do agree, and I've said as much on Twitter when I said I didn't want to argue with people about it. I don't think this is Rick Barnes' fault, and I think if you're playing into the it's Rick Barnes in March, I think it's just kind of, I think as you said, Gene, hitting the pinata, like you want to take a swing at the low hanging pinata, or just kind of grasping at the biggest straw to pull at there. And I get he deserves some blame. Like, he absolutely does. You're the head coach of the program that got bounced. Like, you deserve blame. And I'm not saying he's blameless in this, because there are things he could have done differently in game. There's also things he could have done differently in the offseason to address roster needs that have been an issue all year for Tennessee that were magnified in this game. So it goes back to even not just this game. It goes back to what happened in the summer and early fall with the roster. But I don't think this one's on Barnes. Like, I just genuinely don't. And I think people who are saying it's Rick Barnes in March, what'd you expect? Sometimes this just had, like, you just literally went from making 14 of 24 threes against Longwood to 2 of 18. And that wasn't just a one game aberration for Tennessee against Longwood. You look what they did to close out the regular season. You look what they did in the SEC tournament. Tennessee was shooting hot from three, like, through the last 2 or 3 weeks. It wasn't like they were having inconsistencies and had been shooting poorly. Look back all the way to the, let's see, I'm gonna go back, to the Missouri game on February 22nd, excuse me. Tennessee shot 50% from three in that game. So that, the last loss Tennessee had was against Arkansas in the regular season. At Arkansas, they shot 17% from three. After that, 50% against Arkansas, or against Missouri, excuse me. 37.5% against Auburn. 32% against Georgia. Not your best, but still not bad. 67% against Arkansas. 42% against Mississippi State. 40% against Kentucky. 43% against Texas A&M, and then 58% against Longwood. So they were shooting really well from three for a 7-game stretch? Yeah, 8-game stretch. So in those 8 games, Tennessee as a team was shooting 46% from three in those 8 games. So there wasn't just like Tennessee, this is what they've been doing. They'll have a couple of good games and then a bad one. They've been shooting lights out. So to have expected this to happen, I did not expect this to happen against Michigan. I didn't expect them to shoot, maybe 40% from three or anything like that, but I certainly did not expect the worst shooting game of the season. That's for sure. I think it's an easy, sometimes lazy thing to say, it's Rick Barnes. He's Rick Barnes in March. Gene, we've talked about it on this podcast before, looking back, and specifically at Tennessee, but even some of his times at Texas. Look at the teams that he lost to in those seasons. A lot of times, it's ended up being teams that have gone on runs and had made it to the Elite Eight, made it to the Final Four. I look at last year. Oregon State was an improbable team that made a deep run. That now all of a sudden this past year just was terrible. But you look back at that one. You look at Purdue. Obviously, they ended up losing the next game against Virginia in the Elite Eight. But they about beat Virginia. Like, that was a really, really good Purdue team. Louisville, Chicago made their run, and they're the ones that bounced Tennessee. So, I mean, I'll be interested to see how far Michigan makes it this year, because they're going to play Villanova. They can beat Villanova. I mean, I don't know how far Michigan's going to make it, but they're a team that has suddenly seems like they figured some things out right at the right time, and they're playing up to their talent level. I have a hard time saying this is on Barnes, and that Tennessee is cursed to be a bounced in the second weekend as long as Rick Barnes is head coach, because he's had a lot of issues, and it's fair to say that he has bad luck in March, and that maybe that it's less to do with his coaching style, maybe just bad luck of some of the draws and stuff. But I also saw a good point online that someone made of, look at where he's coached. He's coached at Texas and Tennessee. He's not had, he hasn't coached at Blue Bloods. How many other coaches of non-Blue Blood schools that can be able to point to, 20, 25 years of history and say they've even made a Final Four, or the 3 Elite Eights he's made it to, or as many Sweet 16s he's made it to? Like, how many non-Blue Blood coaches can say that? The only one that comes to my mind would be, Gonzaga's Mark Few. I guess maybe Villanova. I don't know if you consider Villanova a Blue Blood or not, but those are 2 of the only ones I can think of that have consistently been able to make deep tournament runs that aren't at a traditional, Duke, Kansas, Kentucky, North Carolina. So UCLA, I guess, is a traditional Blue Blood. They haven't been, lately, but they are historically a Blue Blood. Louisville, I guess you also can throw them in there too. It's a long-winded way of me saying, Gene, that to go back to what you said earlier, Barnes deserves blame, but it just feels like the lazy answer to me to say, oh, that's Barnes in March. I don't know what you're expecting, because this didn't feel like it was Barnes' fault that Tennessee lost this game. It really, truly did not to me. There are things that he could have done better in the game, but a lot of it was execution. A lot of it was also, I mean, it is what it is. Juwan Howard is a darn good coach. Like he just is. I wasn't super sold on him, with this year specifically, but he's still a pretty darn good coach. And that team and that coaching staff made really good decisions and really good of observations on how to stop Tennessee's offense from doing what they wanted to do, and how to attack Tennessee's defense in a way that Tennessee's defense hasn't really been attacked much this season. A lot of that, again, has to do with the fact they had 3 big men and 3 really talented big men. And I don't think Tennessee's faced a team that has had that much high quality talent in the post all year. Not even Auburn or Kentucky had that much high quality talent depth wise in the post like Michigan does. But I'm not throwing this at Barnes's feet. I'm really not. I don't think it is. I don't think you can do that in this game particularly. I don't think so. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think so.
Right. Well, and look, I understand that, the totality of his career suggests that, you can't do this, you can't do that. But look, is it? I don't know. Is it more impressive? And look, maybe this is hypothetical, maybe this is rhetorical. I don't know, but is it more impressive that Bruce Pearl went to a national final, right? Or was it the Final Four?
He made the Final Four, yeah.
And an elite, the goal is a national championship. So, I guess my question is it? Are we propping certain coaches up because they make a Final Four or an Elite Eight or whatever the case may be? Or because, if we're being honest, if that's the criteria, Pearl's resume is no different than Barnes. If we're being honest, if we're trying to be fair in this regard, because Pearl's been to 1 Final Four, 1 Elite Eight. Barnes has been to at least 1 Final Four.
So technically 2 Elite Eights for Pearl, but yes, I get what you're saying. Yeah.
Well, his season ended in the Final Four once and in the Elite Eight once. Or are you saying he got beat in the Elite Eight twice?
No, I would say, technically, like you said, to get to the Final Four, you had to get to the Elite Eight. So,
well, yeah, but no, I'm just saying his season ended in the Final Four once, Elite Eight once.
Yep, okay.
Which is the same criteria as Rick Barnes. I don't want to do the thing where we prop up a guy to, look, you don't, does Barnes have Mark Few's resume? No. But although I would probably, and look, I've never thought the day would come that I would turn into a Rick Barnes apologist, but here we are. But I would, to be put in a situation where you can go 29-4 every regular season. I'm sorry, go 28-3 every regular season, and just simply say that you're scheduling tough in your non-conference in that matter. Whereas Barnes has played in 2 difficult conferences that at one point or another while he's been coaching there has been labeled the best conference in the country.
Yep.
Some have suggested the SEC is now. There was obviously a time with Kansas and the Big 12 that he was there, that the Big 12 was considered that. And Kansas State had runs. Oklahoma, I felt like, had runs. Blake Griffin was really good there. Baylor, since Barnes left. But, that league is in West Virginia, that league has had quality basketball for a long time. But, I guess, look, I don't want to do the thing where if what Barnes is doing is so much different, it's Boeheim's record. I guess Boeheim gets a pass because he's got a chip, because he got a generational player who had one of the greatest freshman seasons we've ever seen, quite possibly the greatest freshman season we've ever seen. and because of obviously the accomplishments that come along with it with Carmelo in 2003, I know you can throw all these names at me, whatever, here, that, whatever. I mean, people listening to the pod can throw this name or that name. But Carmelo goes in, has an amazing freshman season, and they win a national championship, and he's the most outstanding player. And that's how Boeheim gets his one ring. Like, I just feel like, and look at Boeheim's career outside of that. I guess he's had ultimately more success, but Gap ain't that much different. Is all I'm saying. At the end of the day, Texas is Rick Barnes.
Yeah,
because they're still chasing Rick Barnes. Think about that. Like, Texas is still chasing Rick Barnes' successor. They're on Beard now. Shaka didn't work. They're on their second successor. Look at what they were before him. So, I mean, are you a victim of your own success? Probably so. But the fact of the matter is, like, when we're looking at all this March stuff, and then I'm a totality of the season person.
Mm-hmm.
I don't just tune in. Obviously, Nathanael, you don't either. I don't just simply tune in to college basketball in March and say, well, that guy's not winning in March, so therefore he sucks. So y'all can miss me personally with that. And this dude has coached at 2 football schools where they don't really care. I'm sorry, apologies to the majority of the Tennessee fan base, but you support Orange. You don't support basketball. It's not the same thing. So therefore, you're only going to tune in when A, they're playing Kentucky, or B, they're playing in the NCAA tournament.
Yeah,
you know,
and I think that's the truth for, like you said, a lot of them. I think people who listen to this podcast, a lot of people who listen to this one are more diehard basketball fans because it just is a basketball specific podcast.
Right.
So yeah, but I agree with you. I think my experience even on Twitter is that a lot of people don't tune in to basketball until football season is fully over with, and that includes like national signing. Like there were some people I saw on Twitter back in December saying, I'm not going to care. I'm not going to tune in really until this team gets into SEC play or until we get until football is over. Like I legit saw people tweet that, and like you said, there's nothing wrong with it really. Just if that's how you are as a fan, it's fine. But yeah, I get what you're saying on that front.
Let's be clear on that. Like, there's nothing wrong. I'm not here to judge how people go about their viewing habits. Heck, I'm about to go. I finally have a little bit of free time for the first time since September, it feels like, and I'm going to sit down and watch some bad television that probably is not basketball for a little bit. So again, I'm not judging people's habits, but it just hits a little differently when you've got people. The criticisms are not coming from the people who were there all year long, and it's coming from people who flow in there, spend 3 days celebrating on Twitter when there are more people celebrating the win over Kentucky than were celebrating the SEC championship, because to them the Kentucky win is the one that matters. Like, it's the first time in 40 years, right? 42 years since they won 43 years since they won like, that matters. Like, 3 years ago, I was being told that the season was irrelevant because we didn't, quote unquote, we don't have any hardware. You're number one in the country for a month. We don't have any hardware. Didn't win the regular season championship. Didn't win the tournament championship. Got beat in the NCAA tournament. But like 3 years later, you're beating Kentucky, beating A&M, winning an SEC championship, and instead of celebrating the championship, you're mad because of the seed. I'm like, at some point, basketball seasons are long, man. They're long. Like, if we're being honest, this stuff starts in like June and July when these kids are grinding in the gym, sometimes hot gym, although Pratt Pavilion's amazing. That's when these guys are in here, like, they don't get time off. Like, there's shirts that say basketball never stops.
Yep.
There's some legitimacy to that. They're going to be, look, man, a guy like Vescovy, he's going to be if he's not in the gym today, as we're recording, he'll be in there tomorrow because he hadn't forgotten that. And basketball is a sport that you can constantly work on your craft. Football, you can. Most sports, you can. But you can obviously, man, you don't think the guy Ziegler, knowing that kid's story, won't be in the gym tomorrow? Like, you don't get the breaks. But, like, the unfortunate thing is, not the people that listen, but a vast majority of the people that really support Tennessee, they don't care about that. You know, like those November games that I say don't really necessarily matter. They do matter, but they're not what you're going to be judged on. But I'm judging you on those Power 5 non-conference games. I'm judging you on the 18 SEC regular season games. I'm judging you on everything that transpires in March. And what that told me is they went, 14-4 in the SEC this year? Is that right?
Yep.
14-4 in the SEC. Won the SEC tournament. Came one bad half, against an unfortunate draw. Michigan-Tennessee should not be a second-round game, but here we are.
Yep.
You know, that Michigan team, fair or foul, right or wrong, people can point to whoever they want to, that Michigan team has top 10 talent in the country. They struggled throughout the course of the regular season. They had, obviously, the bad blow-up in the Juwan Howard had the bad blow-up at the end of the Wisconsin game.
Yep.
And, you know, they kind of have galvanized. You know, they've banded together here recently, and they're winning some games. And they've got a really good player who's almost an unstoppable force, especially when the team they're going up against has nothing anywhere near that. And you can't simulate that in the SEC play because all of the SEC bigs are just athletic freaks. Like that's what they are. I mean, they're, you know, like Walker Kessler is a freak. Jabari Smith, we know, is a freak. Just look at the bigs around the SEC that are really quality. There's not one that presents the sort of style of play that Hunter Dickerson plays, where he has a chance to eat you up outside. And, okay, you want to leave me open? I'll knock down a 3 or 2. There isn't a comp for that. And so, like that, it's unfortunate that's kind of how the draw went. Kind of maybe hope that Michigan had lost that first round game. I don't remember they played now.
Colorado State. I wish they had lost that game too.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying? So, are the issues, you know, I don't know what their seed was, maybe 60 or whatever. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what. No, I guess there was somewhere between 41 and 44 on the seed list. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, like that's an unfortunate draw. That was a team that at one point was ranked number 6 in the country. And that's the team that you drew in the second round. Like that's the reality of March. You got to beat them at some point. It wouldn't have been any different if you had lost to them in the Elite 8. Yeah. If you played them in the Elite 8. You know, like it's still the same. It's still the same game. It's just unfortunate this was a second round game. These things happen all the time. I mean, see that Kentucky-Wichita State game about 8-9 years ago. That should not have been a second round game because it was a stupid Kentucky team that was horrible in the regular season and a Wichita State team that I'm pretty sure was undefeated at the time. You know, these things, miss seeds sort of happen. I'm not knocking the process. I'm not knocking the committee. I'm saying that you have teams that don't live up to expectations or whatever the case may be throughout the course of the regular season. And then all of a sudden they maybe turn things on, get a bad seed, and then here they are playing in the the Elite 8, or whatever. And Michigan being an 11 seed is a headache for a lot of people. Colorado State deserves better than having met one of the best regular seasons in its history and drawing Michigan in the first round. Tennessee has his first SEC championship in 43 years. And as a reward for that, gets a 3 seed and gets Michigan in the freaking second round. And like it's unfortunate. It's March, as John Rothstein would say. It's the way it's going to go. And when we turn this into a ratings thing, then that's kind of what you're going to get, because I don't know ratings, whatever, but I'm pretty sure that Michigan Tennessee is the sort of game that draws great viewership. And we've made March Madness, we've made basketball season about 3 weeks, and whittled a 31 game regular season and 3 to 5 games in a in a conference tournament. None of that stuff matters. The Chattanooga's shooter, that shot goes to a little bit to the right or the left, and a team that won the regular season by 2 games is sitting at home playing in the NIT, even though they were the best team over 30-something games. And that's unfortunate. Like, you have so many situations. Like, Murray State's in the tournament. Belmont has a great regular season, is a top 60 team in terms of all the metrics. And because they can't beat Morehead State, they're at home. Tennessee gets a 3 seed because of some obligatory sort of measurement that I'm not even 100% sure about, because I didn't have time to really listen and absorb all of the different things that were said last Sunday as it pertained to Tennessee getting a 3 seed. I just know that nobody that supports Tennessee is very fond of Joe Lunardi, because he basically just regurgitated what the committee told him. Sit him out there to say as a meat shield as to why that they were not going to move Tennessee above a 3 seed. And I hate that. But, like I said, that's when we make things made for TV sort of thing, then we have to drum up suspense. And this is what you get. You get second round matchups that are obviously competitive, but unfortunate because they probably shouldn't be played when they were. But hey, you got to win in March, and last night Tennessee did.
I'm going to end the show on this because you brought it up, and I thought it was an interesting point that I wanted to look at, comparing kind of the resumes of Pearl and Barnes, and just looking at March. So I think it's only fair to kind of look at what Pearl did in Division I, because before he got the job at Milwaukee, he was at Southern Indiana, and they were Division II, and he led them to actually Division II national championship in 1995. So he had a lot of success in Division II with the Screaming Eagles of Southern Indiana, but I'm not going to count that. I'm going to look at once he jumped to Division I in the Horizon League with Milwaukee. So that was the 2001-2002 season. Just looking at the last 20 years with that, from his start at Milwaukee to where he is again. Auburn, as we're recording this, Auburn's still in the NCAA tournament. Who knows how far they go? They are trailing Miami right now, but we'll see if they lose or not. But they could get to they're at least in the second round right now. They could get to another Sweet 16 here. We'll see. But as of right now, looking at just what it is currently, Pearl has had 3 seasons end in the Sweet 16 of the last 20 years. 3 seasons into the Sweet 16, 1 in the Elite 8 and 1 in the Final 4. And yes, granted, he had 3 years off between Tennessee and Auburn, but it was his own fault. He left Tennessee. Well, he didn't leave Tennessee. He got fired. He left Tennessee in disgrace. And then, heck, even last year, Auburn was ineligible because of, they weren't a good team, but they're ineligible also because of stuff that happened with Pearl. So, if you want to get really technical, he could have had more success and whatnot. He was able to stay at Tennessee, but he's also gotten himself in hot water multiple times now. So you can throw that in there too, but whatever. I'm just looking at the facts. In the last 20 years, three seasons end in a Sweet 16 run, 1 in Elite 8, 1 in a Final 4. Over that same span, Barnes has also had 3 seasons end in a Sweet 16. Actually, 3 seasons end in a Sweet 16, 2 end in Elite 8, and 1 in a Final 4. That ain't much different. Like you said, that's 1 Elite 8. That's different. And so technically, if you want to get really technical, Barnes has a better one because he has 1 more Elite 8, but also he coached for a few more years because he didn't get kicked out of coaching with a show cause because he didn't get in trouble. But you're right, Gene. It's not drastically different. Looking at their overall NCAA tournament records is interesting too. Barnes has a losing one. He's 25-26 in the tournament, and whereas Pearl is 15-10. That's still not Pearl's is still not an incredible NCAA tournament record. So I think people get so hung up on Pearl because he got Tennessee to their first ever and still so far only ever Elite 8. But they also forget that Tennessee in his first year, they got bounced in the second round when they probably shouldn't have. in his fourth year, they got bounced in the first round when they probably shouldn't have. And as last year, they got run out of the gymnasium by Michigan in the first round because of all the stuff that would have, that team had basically given up and all the stuff going on there. So people, I think, kind of gloss over and kind of forget some of the bad that were with the good. He also never, Pearl never really had success in the SEC tournament. He got to the finals once. In 2008 or 9? I forget what year it was. They got to the finals there in the SEC tournament. But other than that, they were a lot of times 1 or 2 and done in the SEC tournament under Pearl, from my recollection. Whereas with Barnes, Tennessee's made the finals 3 times, and they won the whole darn thing this year. So it's not apples to apples comparison because, again, they're obviously different situations. If you're comparing just to 2001 to now, Pearl was at Milwaukee for 4 years and so in a smaller school in the Horizon League, so that's a little different. And again, Pearl was out of coaching for 3 years because of his own fault, but still out of coaching for 3 years. But both guys took over pretty big rebuilds at their programs that they are currently at Auburn and Tennessee, and both took over right around the same time. Pearl got back into it, a year before Barnes got into Tennessee, but both guys were taking over rebuilds, and both guys in the 17-18 season got to the NCAA tournament in those years, and both actually got bounced in the second round in both those years too. But to your point, Gene, it's not like there's a massive difference between Barnes and Pearl with their postseason success. Again, that could change with this year. We'll see how far Auburn goes in the NCAA tournament now. I'm going to look at the score before we end the recording here because I'm curious. It was, again, Miami with a very, very slight lead at halftime. But even still, it's not unless he goes to another Final Four, it's not going to be a massive, massive difference between what Pearl has done and what Barnes has done. And right now, Miami's up by 6 over Auburn. I don't know if that'll hold. It's early in the second half, but we'll see. But, Gene, I appreciate you kind of let me ramble a lot here in this episode, but I thought you also made some good points. So I'd appreciate you being a good sounding board and being someone who, consistently this year, this past year that we've done this, and actually it almost will be a year here very soon where we rebranded as a Tennessee only podcast to talk about, just about Tennessee men's and women's basketball. I appreciate you in the last year, bringing the perspective you bring as a former player, as a high school, an AAU level coach and whatnot. So before we end, I want to say thank you, Gene, for the last year and everything you've done. I'm not saying thank you as if we're going off the air or whatever, because we have plenty more to talk about in the coming weeks. And I'll still definitely have some more Lady Vols podcasts because they're in the tournament still. But I do want to say thanks, Gene, because I've appreciated your perspective throughout the year. You've helped me kind of have a different viewpoint on a lot of things with basketball and a different appreciation for a lot of different things that I don't know if I ever would have if I hadn't had this podcast with you. So I just want to say thanks before we end the show here.
I appreciate that, man. I just, Vols fans, I always say I don't hate y'all. I just want to provide a different perspective. There's a lot of times you'll probably like what I say because I try to be fair. Sometimes you won't like what I say because I try to be fair. But I always feel like, and I think the reason why I appreciate the ability to do this podcast is because there are times where you want to kind of be nuanced in what you're saying and not just go hot takey. And, I don't think not everything is about, recruiting, or not everything is about this one specific aspect. I think you're just talking about the games. And I think that, just being able to kind of discuss and talk about games and trends and things. If you listen to this podcast, we've been talking about what would happen, what would cause Tennessee to not win. So it ultimately happened. It's unfortunate. But here we are. And Dow, Barnes has the challenge of trying to put this thing together for next season however he can. But I just feel like Tennessee has a guy who wins. Did he go as far as you wanted in the NCAA tournament? No, but he brought you further than you had in the SEC tournament in my lifetime, literally in my lifetime. Nathanael's lifetime and a lot of people's lifetime. They've never seen Tennessee win an SEC championship in basketball. So while we're, pointing out all those negatives, you can't simply forget that because it doesn't meet a sort of narrative that is pushed by media members outside of Knoxville or wherever we're talking about.
Well, this podcast has gone long, but I knew it would. It could have gone even longer, but I'm going to go ahead and end it here. I want to thank all of you for tuning into this episode and tuning in all season. Again, we're moving into off-season mode for the men's team. Hopefully, Lady Vols will give us another week or so here of postseason talk. We'll have Lady Vol podcasts as well. And Gene and I will talk about Lady Vols because we have before. We will again, but we do have a Lady Vol specific podcast now too. So that's where a lot of it will happen. But Gene and I will talk about it too. But again, thank you all of you all for listening along, watching along, wherever you are, YouTube or Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever. So just want to say thank you to all of you. We'll be back again probably sometime, maybe later on this week, maybe next week to kind of talk about off-season stuff because it's now off-season time in Tennessee. So we're back where we started a year ago, Gene, where we started this podcast, rebranded to Tennessee Podcast, not long after they got bounced in the first round against Oregon State last year. So what comes around goes around. We're back to where we began. So anyway, thank you all so much for tuning in. I'm Nathanael, signing off for Gene. This has been another episode of the Vol Basketball Fever Podcast. Thank you for watching Vol Basketball Fever. Give this video a like and subscribe to the channel while you're here. We appreciate all your support, and the show wouldn't be possible without Vol fans like you. Thank you.